I fully realize that in ancient times and in the Middle Ages, there was a viable place for religious bodies whose sole function was to lead an ascetic and contemplative life. But those days are past, and I no longer see any use or advantage for modern society in preserving and perpetuating these now outdated religious organizations. Quote from Don Bosco's nemesis, Urbano Ratazzi, Italian politician and statesman. This is the final installment of our three-part series on how St. John Bosco opposed the Ratazzi Bill, which called for the suppression of monasteries in Italy. If you'd like to see the other parts, just click on the card that should appear on the top of the screen right about now. The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Subscribe for new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Don Bosco had written various other confidential letters to his sovereign, advising him to do the right thing and to steer his kingdom off the path to ruin. So many letters, in fact, that one day the king exclaimed, "I no longer have a moment's peace. Don Bosco will not leave me alone." Then he instructed a courtier to report his words to Don Bosco. But his rebuke did not have the desired effect. While the matter was being debated in his chambers, King Victor Emmanuel, worried and impatient, wanted to know where that priest lived, the one who caused him so much distress. Early one Monday morning, dressed in everyday clothing, the king went to Valdoco on horseback with one of his aides, and they rode around the oratory. Seeing the cleric Caliero, he called him over and asked for news of Don Bosco. The cleric replied that Don Bosco was in the church, but was tired from hearing the previous day's confessions, preaching, and assisting the young people. Hearing this, the king departed, but he returned in a carriage in a few days. A few moments before he arrived, Don Bosco came down from his room and told Goffi, the porter, "I have a lot to do. Even if the king himself comes, please tell him that I'm not here." That said, he returned to his room. General Alexander Lucchema, Count of Angrogna, got out of the royal coach, entered the oratory, and asked for Don Bosco. Having received the answer from Goffi, he returned to the king, who was waiting. However, the king had told the general vivid accounts of Don Bosco's boldness in writing him about certain threats. Being an impetuous man, the general believed it was his duty to ask Don Bosco to explain the supposed offenses he had committed against the sovereign. So the general returned on horseback several days later. He rode into the courtyard of the oratory, asked directions to Don Bosco's room, and went straight there. And upon arriving, Don Bosco stood up. But before we hear about what this enraged general said to Don Bosco, I'd like to invite you to enroll in our Saturday Mass intentions for the promoters of St. John Bosco by clicking on the link in the description below, or you can wait till the end of the video and click on the logo that's going to appear on the screen. It's a very beautiful Mass done in the traditional Byzantine rite for all of your intentions. Now, you don't have to become a monthly donor to have a Mass prayed for you, but if you do, you could receive an amazing book written by St. John Bosco like this one, The Roadmap to Heaven. So please consider making a small sacrifice to keep these episodes free from filthy YouTube ads and thus helping us to better spread devotion to this great saint. And now on to the story. "Are you Don Bosco?" the general asked resentfully. "I am," Don Bosco replied. "Are you the one who dared to write certain letters to the king, trying to tell him how to govern the kingdom?" the general raged on. Don Bosco protested, "I have written, but never intended to impose my will on anyone." The general interrupted him and started railing against Don Bosco. He called the priest an impostor, a fanatic, a rebel, and an enemy of the king, whose honor he had vilified. He said that Don Bosco had outraged His Majesty and stepped on sovereign authority. Don Bosco tried to interrupt the torrent of insults and endeavored to show him how his letters were not irreverent. The purpose of his writing had been to enlighten the king, because Don Bosco loved his sovereign and was ready to sacrifice anything as a sign of his loyalty. But the general groaned even more, pretending not to understand, or did not want to understand, Don Bosco's reasons. He shouted, "Come now, I have not come to end the matter in mere words. You must give the satisfaction for the insult you dared to address to the king." "And in what way?" Don Bosco asked. "First, in the name of His Royal Majesty, I demand that you no longer write to him about his court and the royal family. The king is furious. If you do not obey, regretful steps will be taken. Now sit down and write what I shall dictate to you." Don Bosco agreed. "Provided it is not a retraction or a denial of the truth, I'm ready." Sitting down, he took up the pen. The general began to dictate a letter in which Don Bosco would offer a humble apology to the king and beg him to disregard the threats and prophecies he had written. Don Bosco put down his pen. "It's not possible for me to write such a declaration." "But you must," the general said. "When I have written it, will you be responsible before God for what might happen?" Don Bosco asked. "God has nothing to do with it," cried the general. "I want you to write what I say." Don Bosco stood up, saying, "I will not write this." At this reply, the furious general put his hand on the hilt of his sword. He seemed to want to challenge Don Bosco to a duel. With admirable calm, Don Bosco said that he had no weapons to defend himself and that his only defenses were reason and religion. He said, "I could challenge you to a duel to see who can pray more. You would pray better and longer than me because you have more free time. The victory would surely be yours." But the general huffed and shook his sword. To end the scene, Don Bosco took a resolute stance, saying, "You think perhaps you're intimidating me with these threats of yours? I tell you openly, I'm not afraid. I'm not at all afraid, because I know with whom I am dealing. You are a gentleman and a valiant soldier. You will certainly not do violence to a poor, unarmed priest who only did what he thought best for the sake of his king's soul. I would have made your visit unnecessary if I had known that you wanted to see me. I would have gone to your palace, where we could have calmly found a way to satisfy the king and at the same time save my conscience. If I do that, I'm sure you will show me kindness and respect. You would take out a bottle of wine upon my arrival, and I would drink to your health." The general no longer knew what to say or do. His anger subsided. Half stunned, marveling at the change in his feelings, he said goodbye to Don Bosco and left. He mounted his horse and exited the gate. Then he stopped, re-entered the courtyard, descended, and returned to Don Bosco's room. "So you say you would come to my house?" he asked. Don Bosco replied, "Most certainly." "Would you still come?" the general asked. "Of course I would come," Don Bosco replied. "Can I take you at your word?" "Absolutely," Don Bosco answered. "Come tomorrow at 11 o'clock then," the general offered. "I can't at that time," Don Bosco said, "because I have business of great importance then." "What about 3 o'clock in the afternoon?" Don Bosco agreed. "Tomorrow at 3 then. I will be there." The general looked intently at Don Bosco and then left. The next day, Don Bosco kept the appointment. He was received with every courtesy and calmly composed a letter he was comfortable sending to the king. Don Bosco signed it. In the letter, he said that he regretted any displeasure he had given to his sovereign, because it was not his intention to offend him in the least. As for his predictions, the king should use his own judgment. He concluded by promising that he should write no more letters. The king had already signed the law, and no one could deny what had occurred. However, Don Bosco later said he would never have signed that paper unless he sought to avoid a greater evil. Don Bosco's conversation with the general lasted for an hour. It was increasingly cordial and good-humored. The general wanted Don Bosco to stay and have lunch with him, but Don Bosco excused himself, saying he already had lunch. Then the general stopped Don Bosco as he was about to leave and told him, "Before you leave, please taste the wine made from my vineyards. I want to seal our friendship." A servant appeared with a wine bottle and a box filled with pastries. Having filled the glasses, Don Bosco looked at the general and smiled. The general smiled too, and taking a pastry, he offered it to Don Bosco. Don Bosco joked, "I hope it's not poisoned." The general replied, "I'll eat half of your pastry if you like," and so he did. After a few minutes, they shook hands and parted. From then on, they were friends. The general wanted to have a young African boy baptized whom he had brought back from his travels. He presented him to Don Bosco so that he could convert him to Christianity. However, the government soon found yet another way to harass Don Bosco through tempting him into accepting some valuables that had been seized from the monasteries. One day, Count Cavour sent the oratory 2 huge cartloads of linen that had been confiscated from the Dominican monastery. Don Bosco was in severe financial difficulty at the time, but he nevertheless ordered that the carts were to remain untouched. Some people pointed out that many sacred vestments were falling into profane hands, and that it would therefore be better if Don Bosco bought them. But he always replied, "Well, you're probably right, and this would also be a golden opportunity to provide my churches with many things that we need, and perhaps will never be able to afford. However, if the oratory were closed down, I would not particularly like to see my things in other people's churches. It would hurt me deeply, and I'm sure that the monks would feel the same way if they saw me in possession of their goods." He would also never accept monasteries or convents that were frequently offered to him by the government until Pope Pius IX himself ordered him to do so. The Pope said it was better that those properties be returned to the church through Don Bosco's hands than through anyone else's, which showed how much the Pope respected our dear saint. Thank you all so much for watching this 3-part series on Don Bosco's letters to the king, and I myself enjoyed telling you these stories very much. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.